So, Mary, how's it going?
Hey, Amy, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah. Enjoying this election season?
Oh my God, no. Actually, I keep waffling between like being glad I'm not in the US during the election and then kind of wanting to be there, following everything more closely. But yeah, man, it's just,
I'm in such a weird place with it because on the one hand, I don't feel, and maybe this is just because something has broken deep down inside of me, I don't feel the intense sense of dread that I felt in 2016. It doesn't feel like Donald Trump is imminent. And it felt that way in 2016 and in 2020. So as that demonstrates, I have been wrong before in my life. Does that mean that I'm like super crunk and excited about Kamala Harris? No, but I don't know if I'm capable of getting like that with any politician ever again. But yeah, Donald Trump feels like I'm going to be sent to a gulag. You know what I mean? I've said enough shit publicly and he's crazy enough that feels like eventually he would get around to rounding up people like me in gulags or whatever. So yeah, it doesn't feel like his victory is imminent. It also doesn't feel like Kamala Harris is imminent or that she's going to be fantastic either. Like, I need this chick to say she's going to stop arming Israel.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just...
She's definitely not... She's saying the opposite.
She's saying the opposite of that. And I'm not happy about that. I'm not happy about that at all.
Let me ask you something someone asked me recently, and I was kind of like, I think that's true, actually. They were saying that it seems like climate is just not being discussed as much at all.
No.
As it was. I feel like actually the last election cycle, it was pretty front and center, but it's really like absent from the conversation right now.
It's absent from the conversation. You barely heard about it at all at the DNC. And even folks who I know who are in the climate space are still just like, well, this is not the time to push the administration. And it's just like, see, this is why y'all are not serious as a movement. And largely why I don't think I see myself as part of the climate movement anymore. Between this and just like utter spinelessness and the silence on Gaza lets me know that we don't want the same things. And if that's the world that you want to preserve, I don't want to be in that world. Yeah. So, I just don't see myself as part of the broader movement anymore.
Damn, Mary, that's a big public announcement.
Is it?
I think you've been saying it, though.
I think I've shown that through my actions, you know? Like, do I want a livable future? Sure, but I don't think they do.
Well, that's the thing is it's like, I, again, have heard people make this argument. And I've seen it actually with people criticizing Greta Thunberg for protesting in favor of Palestine, saying, you're muddying the waters. It's the same argument that's been made over and over again, right? Don't muddy the waters on climate with labor rights or civil rights or reproductive justice or
with
rights,
climate.
Or, you know what I mean? It's just
with actual climate. These are the same people who will say in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, now's not the time to talk about climate change because we don't want to insert politics. These are the same people who will say during an election like this, it's not the time to push the Democrats to talk about climate because we don't want to muddy the election. Just say you don't want to do shit. You want to go hide in your little closet.
Yeah. It reminds me every time of the conversation that we had with Rev Yearwood probably like 2-3 years ago now, where he was talking about the origins of the environmental movement and how it was all the people that didn't want to be part of any of the other social justice. That history is alive and well.
Or went away. And having worked, in environmental nonprofits, the quote unquote big greens, I knew plenty of folks who were in those positions because they wanted to go somewhere where they felt like they could be unproblematic, right? They felt like science was just inherently unproblematic. And it's like, well, okay, girl, but once upon a time, phrenology was science. So I don't know.
Right. We have a lot to talk about today because we're going to talk about Project 2025 and all of the many different layers of that, including some of the specific plans that are laid out, but also how people are talking about it, how people are and aren't understanding it, how the media is covering it, all of that stuff. So we're going to take a quick ad break, and then we're going to get back to that conversation. This is Spill. I'm Amy Westervelt.
I'm Mary Annaïse Heglar.
We'll be back.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
My day kicks off with a refreshing Celsius energy drink, then straight to the gym. Pre-K pickup, back home to meal prep. Time for my fire station shift. One more Celsius, gotta keep the lights on. When the 3-alarm hits, I'm ready. Celsius. Live, fit, go. Grab a cold, refreshing Celsius at your local retailer or locate now at Celsius.com.
Okay, so this bitch is long as hell. Project 25 is like 900 some odd pages.
I have the PDF open right now, and it is 922 pages long.
Exactly. And like so many of our listeners, likely, we have shit to do. So I have not read this entire thing. I have read some of the parts that are relevant for climate, in particular, the EPA chapter. So I feel like that's where we should start. And as I was reading it, I have written down some questions for you, starting with, before we even get to the thing, the author is someone named Mandy M. Ganasakara. I think that's how you say that. And I wrote down here, who the fuck is this bitch?
Mandy. Mandy has like a very interesting background. She doesn't have a science background. That's important to know.
That's important.
No environmental science background, no science background, period. She has like a poli-sci degree and a law degree, and she immediately went to work on Capitol Hill as an aide for various senators. She is the person on Senator Einhof's team who handed him the infamous snowball on the floor of the Senate. So I don't know if people remember this almost 10 years ago now, where Senator Einhof held up a snowball in the Senate and was like, "It's snowing outside. How can global warming be happening?"
Was it snowing outside that day, or did they just happen to have a snowball in the freezer?
It was snowing. It was snowing. Okay. And there's this hilarious picture where like he's doing that, and Mandy is very smugly smiling behind him. She's so pleased with herself. So yeah, she's been kind of in the sort of climate denier network for a long time. She went to work for an organization called the CO2 Coalition, which is this organization that basically argues that more CO2 is actually good for the planet because we're going to grow more plants, and that, sure, some places won't fare well, but other places will, and that it'll all balance out in the end. And people are like being unnecessarily freaked out about CO2.
So like just vibes.
Totally vibes. She worked for them. I remember her. She actually was the Republican witness who testified during the first hearing that Congress had on climate disinformation, which was in 2019. Jamie Raskin held this committee hearing about disinformation in the oil companies, and she was the Republican witness, and she gave this whole testimony about how actually we need fossil fuels for poor people in Africa and all of this kind of stuff. So she's just kind of like been around, right? And then she also was in the Trump administration and working at the EPA under Trump. So she was the chief of staff for EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeland. So I would not be surprised at all to see her put forth as a potential EPA administrator. She's a director, the Independent Women's Forum Center on Energy and Conservation. The Independent Women's Forum is this organization that was kind of set up to do all the things that Phyllis Schlafly did. Phyllis Schlafly was the conservative woman who fought against women's rights in the 80s. That's kind of what the Independent Women's Forum is. It's like, we need to put conservative ideas in the mouths of women, and these are the women who do that. So anyway, that's who Mandy is. Yes. And she's definitely not someone who remotely has the sort of scientific background that a lot of people think should be guiding the Environmental Protection Agency. She has no scientific background.
Did anyone help her with this with any sort of scientific background?
I don't think so. There's not a lot of science in it. That's the thing.
No, it's a lot of science
political
out of it. So yeah, let's talk about that. So one thing I see over and over again is basically removing scientists and science from decision-making processes and replacing them with political appointees. And they're doing this, Amy, because the EPA is already too political, because
it's so crazy, right? It's like so, the EPA is too political, so make it more political. What?
Fight politics with politics? What are we doing?
I don't get it. It's also strange because it's like, well, I guess that works for you in a Trump administration, but then as soon as anyone else is in power, isn't it a problem for you again? I don't really understand the logic here.
Let me just read this sentence. The challenge of creating a conservative EPA will be to balance justified skepticism toward an agency that has long been amenable to being co-opted by the left for political ends against the need to implement the agency's true function, protecting public health and environment in cooperation with the states. So there's a lot here about anything related to climate change, especially if that thing related to climate change is related to climate justice, that is leftist ideology, politics, or whatever. That is not science. Right. That's not proven, even though it is like bulletproof science at this point. Yeah. They are characterizing it as automatic politics.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the interesting thing too is that there's a real problem on the right when they talk about environmental policy, because most conservative voters do actually care about clean air and clean water, right?
You kind of need.
They always have to straddle this line of being anti-climate but pro-clean air and clean water. But when you read into the details of what she's suggesting in this chapter, it's walking back a bunch of the science-based regulations on air pollution and a bunch of the science-based regulations on clean water that actually don't have anything to do with climate and are not political at all. Sorry, there's a leaf blower in the background of my audio. You guys are going to hear it.
It's okay.
The sound of Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's this very strange piece of writing where she's talking constantly about the importance of clean air and clean water and public health, while also suggesting eliminating the things that provide clean air and clean water and protect public health.
Exactly. I saw that in the clean water section, and one of the things they say they want to exclude speculative analysis regarding future potential harm, which would mean they wait for the disaster to happen. So if I come to you and bring you evidence that running this pipeline underneath this body of water is really dangerous and has a 90% chance of that oil getting into the water and contaminating it, you're going to call that speculative analysis, as opposed to everything will be done basically after the fact, correct?
Yeah. And actually, we have a really good example of why that's a bad idea in Standing Rock. So the Dakota Access Pipeline was built despite the fact that the environmental impact assessment was very much still up for debate. Pipeline got built in the meantime. Now, finally, the environmental impact assessment was only finalized earlier this year. And the analysis says, oh, this is actually potentially dangerous. They've now done an analysis on what could happen if they remove the pipes. And they're like, oh, it could cause all of this environmental disaster. So like, we don't want to do that. But it's like, yeah, the same exact thing was possible when you put the pipeline in.
So One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is
Yeah.
what the fuck happened to QAnon?
Oh,
And
shit.
right? Because like it was this big intricate conspiracy,
Yeah.
and it kind of just seemed like it dissipated. But I was reading an article about it last night, and they were talking about how basically QAnon doesn't need to exist anymore because so much of that ideology and
It's
just
like,
even the language has been adopted by the actual mainstream Republican Party. And
yeah.
I gotta say, reading
So
through this,
scary. Oh,
reading through
God.
this, I felt like I heard a lot of echoes of the QAnon sort of ideology. So just
Yeah.
to take you through that, there's a part where they're saying they want the EPA to take a more supportive role toward local and state efforts, building them up so they may lead in a meaningful fashion. And that to me sounds like states' rights, but for the
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
They're demeaning the EPA's pursuit of a globally focused agenda by participating in the Paris Agreement, by giving grants
Globalism.
to developing countries. And that's just America first and globalism. And then there's another part where they're talking about the EPA should make public and take comment on all scientific studies and analyses that support regulatory decision making. And they're talking about take comment from regular ass people,
Yeah.
like people like Mandy who have no scientific background whatsoever. And
Yeah.
that to me sounds like do your own research,
Mhm.
which is like
Totally.
huge big part of QAnon. So
Yeah.
this is a QAnon agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole like taking public comment thing is part of a proposal that's been floated for a long time. It's the transparency in science, or getting rid of secret science at the
Mhm.
EPA. It's how it's like referred to. And that is a Steve Malloy joint.
Oh wow. That was so smooth, Amy.
So smooth. He was a tobacco lobbyist for a long
Mhm.
time. He worked on all of these organizations that helped to suppress the science on secondhand smoke. And then he went to work for coal companies, and he has had a bee in his bonnet about air pollution forever. And he's been warning the right that if environmentalists and or the left ever really get it together to do their messaging on air pollution, it's game over for a bunch of fossil fuels anyway, because combustion of fossil fuels is what generates most particulate matter, right? So he's been saying that for a long time. And he came up with this proposal in the 90s and then like basically dusted it off and included it in the transition plan for Trump for the EPA. And they almost got it passed at the end of the Trump administration. It didn't quite land. So they are bringing it back again. And I think that, yes, scientific research should be as transparent and open and like open to scrutiny and all of that stuff as possible, right? But he tries to kind of be like, oh, like they're doing human testing that they're keeping secret. And like because of that, people are dying. There's this one woman who took part in an air pollution study who did end up dying. And the circumstances of her death are very shady. And I think there probably is some liability for the people who did that study or whatever. But he kind of points to that as being indicative that there's a bunch of shady, mysterious science happening at the EPA. And he wants to institute rules that would basically make it impossible for any scientific study to be used for regulation. It would have to meet such a high bar of that it would just make it impossible for the EPA to regulate anything, which, by the way, the EPA already struggles to regulate things that they fully know cause cancer. So I'm working on a story right now about an herbicide that everyone knows causes Parkinson's. And yet the US EPA cannot ban it. Because
are they able to ban PFAS?
I mean,
has that been a big
sort of, but now part of this Project 2025 thing, they want to roll back any restrictions on PFAS. But that took what, 20, 30 years worth of litigation and hundreds to thousands of people with cancer and all sorts of other things to get that done. The EPA is not good at regulating things that harm the public now.
We should
a
talk
whole...
just really fast about what PFAS is, in case anybody doesn't know. It's polyfluoroalkyl substances.
Yeah.
And it's in mad shit, like mad
It's
shit.
like the stuff that makes your clothes waterproof or your cookware nonstick. It's a coating that's used for a bunch of different fabrics and products and stuff. And, you know, DuPont and 3M, there again, absolutely knew what the potential impact of this stuff were. And in those cases, it's not just that people are getting exposed through consumer products, which they are, but also that the manufacturers that were making it were dumping shit in local waterways. So people's water is contaminated.
Yeah. And we're running around with plastic all up in our guts. So there's that. Yeah. So another thing that the Project 2025 folks want to do is they want to get rid of anything dealing with environmental justice, like a fucking heat-seeking missile.
They really do. They're just like, get rid of it. That's yeah.
So the Biden administration had created an environmental justice and civil rights office. Off the bat, they want to get rid of that. They feel like that should be in the office of the administrator and under the guide of a political appointee, because what could go wrong? And then they want to get rid of any funding going to work that they deem superfluous or not really related to the environment. We all know what that means. That's environmental justice. Yeah. And one of the main tools it seems like they want to use is pause and review. So, Amy, can you talk about what pause and review is?
It's like a way to kill things without killing them. It's like, oh, we're just going to pause this program and review what kind of a return on investment we've been getting, what the impact is, and then we'll come back to it and decide if it should still have the same budget or maybe it should be folded into another agency or whatever. It's a very like diplomatic way to get rid of something without saying that you're getting rid of it.
Right. You just stall and stall and stall, right? It's like when you're trying to make plans with your friends and they don't want to just outright say, I don't want to go. So they just... Maybe. Or they just don't fucking respond.
I don't know what you're talking about, Mary.
All your friends get back to you immediately. Okay. No, this is a problem with being a millennial. I think I have a lot of friends who get like overwhelmed by the thought of making plans. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, it's a very clear way of saying no without saying no. And so this is going to sound so pathetic. My friends like me, I swear.
No, totally kidding. I absolutely have those conversations.
Yes. Everybody does that shit. So just like, so that's what they're planning to do with environmental justice. And then there's also all these parts where they just explicitly want to get the fuck rid of it. They feel like it's reverse racism.
They actually mentioned that. And that's interesting too, because that is a whole thing that's underway as well. I keep meaning to write about this because I feel like a lot of people are not seeing how much that is a continuation of an effort that started in the 80s and 90s in some of the same people. And the only reason I know that is because I worked on this show, This Land, with Rebecca Nagel, and we were looking into these constitutional challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act. And they were being brought by a group of different attorneys, and there were all of these organizations that were filing briefs, and it was all a lot of the same people that are involved in Project 2025. Actually, it was like Heritage and Cato and all of these like right-wing think tanks. And the more we dug into it, the more we realized like, oh, okay, these guys have been trying to do this for a really long time. And it's interesting because in the 80s and 90s, it was actually Clarence Thomas helped them develop a better strategy, because he was like, you guys need to stop with the reverse racism thing. You sound like whiny white boys.
Was he on Supreme Court by this point?
No, he was working for the Equal Opportunity Commission.
Gotcha. Right. This is before Anita Hill and all
before that. Anita Hill, where he worked with Anita Hill. Yeah.
But he was okay. This is during Anita Hill.
Yeah. So he was like, you guys you need a better strategy. He basically was like, make it about equal opportunity, not about reverse racism, because that's never play well. And they did, and it was a very successful strategy. That is how they rolled back a bunch of civil rights gains. And now they've kind of gone back to the old school, this is racist against white people thing.
Yeah.
In all of these cases, this guy, Stephen Miller, who was Trump's chief of staff, has a
Oh
new
my gosh.
legal organization, and they're going after things like there was a venture fund that had a contest for Black women founders, and they've gone after them
Mm-hmm.
for being
That
discriminatory.
doesn't surprise me at all. That doesn't surprise me at all. I could see them, really going after anybody who's ever worked in DEI.
Yes.
And in their next, or any organization that's ever had a DEI.
They are. They want to get rid of DEI entirely. They want to get rid of any kind of straightforward attempts to address racial inequality. That's it.
Or any kind of inequality, right? So
yeah, exactly. So, and you see that in this EPA chapter too, where it's just like, oh, why should these communities get special treatment? Whatever.
Yeah. And the other thing that they really want to get rid of or neuter is the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah. So I'll let you talk about that.
They're basically like, well, it's a spending bill, so you don't actually have to spend money. That's their strategy, is they're like, you could just not. Which,
let positive review going on there, right?
Exactly. That is a flaw in the IRA that's been pointed out time and time again, is that it's all spend, no regulation. There is absolutely nothing that requires that money to be spent. I think they will struggle with some of those programs, and they're going to have a real interesting juggling act to do because the fossil fuel industry loves the IRA. Because they have figured out a way to fund carbon capture, all these bullshit hydrogen hubs. It's a real bonanza for them.
It's like a feeding frenzy.
Yeah, so they're going to struggle to, I don't know, like they're going to have to find ways to shut down all the parts they don't like and keep the ones they do like going. But,
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I would give this chapter an F. It's bad. I don't want it. We could talk about it forever, but there's also other ways that the environment shows up through Project 2025. In particular, we wanted to talk about NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The thing that gives us our weather reports.
NOAA is the other one that, just like the environmental justice stuff, they're very explicit about just getting rid of it. They're like, there's a couple things in there. Those can be folded into other agencies, and otherwise this shouldn't exist.
So NOAA is the reason why I know whether or not there's a tropical wave that could turn into a hurricane and can start planning my evacuation. Without NOAA, as I understand it, like they could privatize weather reports. So creating, right now, we can all see the weather for free in as much detail as we want to. That actually is a space where like the science is open and transparent and open for public comment. Like NOAA is a perfect example of what they're saying they want at the EPA. And then it doesn't, but they want to kill NOAA and get rid of exactly that function.
Yeah, they're talking about, they actually make this argument that weather forecasts from private companies are more reliable than the ones from NOAA, which is weird because I'm reasonably certain that a lot of the private services use NOAA data.
Would they have, those private services would have to pay for NOAA's data?
Or they would have to
conduct it themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Like take over those satellites themselves, or I don't know. Anyway, then they also they actually specifically talk about the hurricane monitoring. So the National Hurricane Center, they say that it provides an important service, but this is what they say in this chapter. Data collected by the department should be presented neutrally, without adjustments intended to support any one side in the climate debate. What the fuck are they talking about? This idea is not at all subtle insinuation that they're manipulating the data to make it look like there's something to be said about the link between hurricanes and climate. And it's like, oh my God, okay. So really, basically what they're saying is the only way that any of NOAA's current activities can continue or should continue is if they're not allowed to attach any of it to climate. And then they're also saying to fold a bunch of it into the US Coast Guard, the US Geological Survey, the entire Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. They want to get rid of because they say it's the source of much of NOAA's, quote, climate alarmism.
Oh my goodness. They're alarmists about climate alarmism.
Data collection is very important and necessary, but that can just be collected and then like made available to companies. That's kind of all we need to do. Their general approach.
Am I correct in assuming this could create a world where there is a hurricane coming and we don't know?
Absolutely. I think it could certainly lead to that. Even though they're saying like this, that this public service component is important and that they would basically want like the Coast Guard to take that over. But then there's nothing in here about like, okay, but there's already a system in place. There's a whole system in place and it works pretty well. Like,
yeah.
What's the plan for the Coast Guard taking that over without the staff that runs that system? Or, you know what I mean? It's just sort of like, I don't know why you would want to upend an emergency alert service in that way.
And I mean, I shudder to think what they want to do with FEMA and with disaster response because, you know, and we've talked about this one-on-one before, but Project 2025 is alive and well in places like Florida, Louisiana, Texas, right? And I'm thinking specifically of Texas and Houston and what happened during Hurricane Beryl, which came aground as a Category 1 and shut a major city down and flooded a major city for days at a time. And it barely made any sort of news because, you know, there's so much chaos going on, but also like you don't see this governor who's a media hog. You don't see him out there talking about it. You don't see him really even caring about what happens in Houston. And so to me, that feels like, you know, a portal to what we could expect for disaster response.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just like briefly scanning for FEMA mentions here. So two things that I'm just like, oh my God, why? One is that they want to basically bring the private sector in to the post-disaster loan.
Oh, that's a bad idea. The insurance companies are already like, fuck New Orleans.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like, what? And then they also are talking about moving FEMA into the Department of the Interior or possibly the Department of Transportation and possibly like combining it with another agency. So that to me sounds like downsizing FEMA, which I'm like at a time when disasters are increasing, you know?
Right. So
downsize FEMA at a time when disasters are increasing. They want to take the loan governance thing away from the SBA and put it in the hands of private sector. So you're going to end up with totally predatory post-disaster chaos.
Exactly. And by design.
Yeah.
Like by intricate design, not an accident. They absolutely are doing it on purpose. This isn't a case of we couldn't have anticipated that these things would happen. We know what climate change is going to look like. Hurricane Katrina is in the rearview mirror. We know what happens when you don't prepare for a disaster. We know what happens when you leave people, you know, to fend for themselves with no sort of order whatsoever. So they're doing it on purpose. They looked at Hurricane Katrina's response and saw inspiration and not horror.
Yeah. So, no, they refer to FEMA's preparedness grants in this Project 2025 document as, quote, pork for states.
Ah! I'm surprised they didn't call it soy. I just, you know, and it reminds me of, I know I said earlier, I don't know if I'm part of the climate movement anymore, but like the whole reason I feel like I got involved in the first place was you see those images from Katrina, you see that those people look like you, and that is what is waiting on me in climate change.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, here we are. And we have folks in the climate space being like, now's not the time to push on climate change. So unserious.
I know.
Unserious.
Yeah. Another component to this, which was really like you kind of see hints of it throughout this document, but then in the undercover reporting that the Center for Climate Reporting did, where they had someone sort of pose as a prospective donor to Project 2025 and get more detail on their plans, definitely a huge erosion in civil rights and a militarized approach to dealing with protest. So they the write up of like their meeting with the Project 2025 people, the Center for Climate Reporting wrote, later a reporter asked what will happen if there are left-wing protests in response to deportations, they're very,
they want to deport Palestinian protesters.
There's a whole like anti-immigration thing as well, and lots of people being deported.
They're talking about deporting pro-Palestine protesters, and it's like, where would they deport me to?
Yeah, it's
Africa in general.
So horrible. Yeah,
it's like a catapult.
This is the kind of thinking that is happening here. So they asked them, okay, but what if there were protests in response to the deportations? And they said the plan would be to bring in the military. And the person who's like speaking to them from Project 2025 says, I think they would attempt a color revolution.
What is a color revolution? Do they mean a race war?
I think they mean a race war.
Yeah,
he goes on to say, where they have riots, where they have everything you've seen in other countries. George Floyd obviously was not about race. It was about destabilizing the Trump administration.
Awesome.
Our view is that the president has the ability, both along the border and elsewhere, to maintain law and order with the military.
Okay. So that is disturbing. And that is the point where, like, when Joe Biden was still the nominee, and just incredibly hawkish for Israel. Folks were saying that Trump and Biden are like what and what when it comes to Palestine. And I get it. I really, really get it. Joe Biden, like, heartbreaking when it comes to Gaza. But also, I do think Trump would be worse in the sense that he would criminalize
the protest
it. Like, not just even criminalize it. I think he would like make it a death sentence, like shoot on sight type of situation. Because he wanted to do that several times during his presidency.
Yeah.
And the military wouldn't do it. And now I think, he's learned, find lackeys.
Right.
So find yes men. And there are plenty of them. There are plenty of them out there. So
yeah.
I don't know. It's just like I was saying at the beginning, like I'm not, goo goo gaga over Kamala Harris. I definitely see the problems, but I have to admit that Trump is just untenable.
Yeah.
Just untenable. And but I also don't think that means that we have to, that Kamala Harris is above criticism.
No, I find that whole idea that you cannot criticize the Democrats at all because that's basically giving the election to Trump. To be very...
I don't see that at all.
Yeah. I just am like...
A lot of people think that.
I know. In fact, actually, it's because I don't want to see another Trump presidency that I want the Democrats to improve, because I know that will bring in more voters.
Yeah. Right. And I think where I'm at is I can bring myself to vote for Kamala Harris, but I cannot bring myself to campaign for her. I definitely can't bring myself to like chastise anyone else who's like, yeah, she's got too much blood on her hands for me. What am I supposed to say to that?
Yeah.
Like I don't see the blood too. You know what I mean?
Certainly not trying to distance herself from it.
I haven't heard her much since the DNC. I did not enjoy her speech where she starts talking about her support for Israel. But what was very noticeable to me is like when she talks about Gaza, first of all, I noticed the introduction of the passive voice. I didn't like that. But I also noticed that those same words coming out of the mouth of Joe Biden would have been just like utterly shocking and like would have sent us all into a tailspin. Like him actually acknowledging the suffering of Gaza in the detail that she did would have been very shocking. So
Yeah. So
I
that's
do
an
think we
improvement.
have to say it's not nearly enough, not even a fraction of enough, but that is a difference. So that does feel
Yeah.
like a little bit of a distance to me. It's not nearly enough. I have to keep saying that. And what I also notice is that when she's articulating the suffering of the Palestinians, that is when she gets more of a response from the crowd. And so I just think about what would it have been like if they had gotten a Palestinian speaker? Like they would have gotten a standing ovation, I think. And
Yeah.
what would that have looked like on all of those cameras?
Yeah.
Because this is not a fringe issue. And this isn't even a divisive
No.
issue. I refuse to pronounce divisive as divisive. I'm so sorry. I can't do it.
No, I
Anyway,
say a
it's
divisive too. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Divisive. And anyway, it's not a divisive issue. The vast majority of Democrats, the vast majority of people in this country want
Yeah.
a ceasefire. This is not controversial.
Yeah. That's right. Even
Nobody
people
likes seeing dead
like,
kids.
I feel like it was pretty telling when Amy Schumer was like, "I've never said I'm not for a ceasefire." I was like, "I'm sorry."
Okay. We need to do something about all of these Amy's.
I know. I'm sorry for all the Amy's.
We gotta until we figure out what's going on,
Yeah.
think, pause and review on the Amy's. So y'all got some work to do.
That's true. It's true.
But I did want to ask about the Center for Climate Reporting. So they use some tactics that a lot of American journalists don't use. It's basically like a sting operation. You're a journalist,
Yeah.
famously so. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, the whole way that I met the guys who run the Center for Climate Reporting was that the first time that they did a big sting was actually back when they were working for Unearthed, and they did the Exxon lobbyist sting. So they posed as, someone who was hiring, and they did interviews with these guys, and they just like spilled all the beans on. And at the time, it was really good. Yeah. And at the time, a bunch of campaigners, like, why can't our journalists do stuff like this? And I was like, well, like that's, like activists can get away with that, but journalists can't because we would be sued, this, that, the other. And Lawrence Carter, who runs the Center for Climate Reporting, was like, excuse me, but like, I'm a journalist and blah, blah, blah. So actually I had him on to Drill to talk about it because I was like, oh, tell me more. So he kind of walked me through the history of using that tactic in the UK, and that they have a pretty solid kind of checklist for what warrants a situation where that kind of tactic should be used, and then how do you do it in an ethical way and all of that kind of stuff. And I started looking into it more, and I was like, actually, US journalists did used to do that a fair bit. And it was largely Herb Schmertz and Mobil Oil that put an end to it. And always
all
comes
roads
back
lead to Herb Schmertz. All roads. Yeah.
Yes, there's some archival footage of him during the 60 Minutes panel where he's ranting, it's unethical and journalists shouldn't do it and this, that, and the other. And then
because it hurts.
And several other corporations too, not just Mobil, but Herb was definitely like, the guy rallying everyone around this, really got together and filed some lawsuits against organizations that were doing it, and kind of kicked up enough of a fuss and made it clear that there would be expensive legal threats, to the point where it almost never happens in US media anymore. But then you've got like the Project Veritas guy who does it on the right. And like he does it in a really unethical and very sloppy way. So that's the only reference point people today have is like that guy. So they see that tactic and they go, oh, like, ooh, that's not, whatever. But I think there is an argument to be made for, and this is a good example of like, how else would we get someone from Project 2025 to honestly lay out what they're trying to do?
I mean, I honestly feel like maybe they should do it for polling, right? Because Republicans are far less likely to respond to a poll, which is why, like, I don't know. I've been complaining about this on Twitter and no one's listening, but we're seeing all of this news about like Harris is ahead in the polls and blah, 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 blah. And like, the polls ain't been right for the past 2 elections. So I don't know how much I trust that. So like, What is anybody doing that sort of reporting where they go to Trump rallies and talk to Trump supporters and see what they're saying? Like, are the crowds still packed? Are the supporters still participating? Like, what's the vibe at the Trump rallies? Because that was the part that no one wanted to take seriously. In 2016, his supporters were like riled up. And like, so are people not showing up for him anymore?
I know one thing. So 2 things that I know just from like reporters that I know who live in swing states or rural states or conservative states. One is that he is not on the campaign trail, like almost at all.
Yeah.
Apparently he has very few field offices even, which is strange.
Ooh.
Which I think was...
he really took this for granted.
He thought he was running against Biden. And Biden is also an old man who wasn't going to be getting out much and also didn't have a lot of field offices. So, Kamala Harris, even though she's not young, but she seems like a college student compared to these guys.
I mean, she's also, Black people don't age like that. You know what I mean? So like a Black 59 is not the same as Tim Walz can show you. They're the same age, bro.
You are kidding me.
They're the same age. Mm-hmm.
That's hilarious, actually.
It is hilarious. He's funny about it. He's like, yeah, I ran the school lunchroom for like 10 years. You don't leave that job with all your hair. So...
Well, anyway, she's showing up everywhere, like they're doing a bunch of events and whatever. So with Trump, it's like he's having significantly fewer rallies, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then a friend of mine who's in Pennsylvania was like, yeah, actually, like I drove through the part of Pennsylvania that's like most Trumpy.
Yeah.
And she's like, the signs were out, but definitely not as much as like 2016, probably about half as many signs. So that's interesting.
I am seeing online like a lot of the we can't call them alt-right, but like the far-right white supremacist groups are starting to break with him. Like Nick Fuentes is frustrated with him. And at first it started with a lot of these types of people saying that they were turning on the Trump campaign. They still like Trump, but they felt like the people around him
don't like
not doing what they wanted. And they were like, until the Trump campaign corrects itself, we're heading for a loss. And like Nick Fuentes like declared war on the Trump campaign. And now I'm seeing he's frustrated with Trump, the person, because Trump is saying things like he's acknowledging now that Biden is the president because he's saying like, there was a coup against an American president. Isn't that terrible? He's saying things like, I lost by a sliver in 2020. So Nick Fuentes is like, oh, I'm sorry, you lost? I thought it was stolen. What happened to stop the steal? All these people like had their lives ruined trying to get the election back for you. So like now people are starting to get pissed at Trump. And then there's the thing about the abortion stance, right? Like he had this vote on abortion rights in Florida, and Trump was saying he was going to vote against the DeSantis bill or the pro-life bill. Yeah. And because it was only like 6 weeks, and he was like, I think people need more time. So he said he was going to vote no. And then there was this big backlash, and he went back and said, now I'm going to vote yes. And so he changed his mind in public due to pressure from abortion folks. So those are the things that make me feel like this is not, he's losing support. And so I don't want to say that gives me hope, because Kamala Harris is not, my favorite person in the world either, but I'm a hell of a lot more comfortable with her in the White House than I am with other people. And it's like the way that we think about elections, I think maybe needs to change, right? Like you're not electing a friend, you're electing an opponent. So like, who do you want to organize against? And do you want to organize against Donald Trump, or do you want to organize against Kamala Harris? I'll take Kamala Harris in a heartbeat.